Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome to this update on the forecast for today's severe weather threat, taking aim at the Gulf Coast states. We haven't seen a ton of change from yesterday's video that came out in the early afternoon hours, but we have seen some new outlook lines drawn, and now that we have some observed data to go over, I thought it'd be nice to go over that, go over some of the model data, and take a look at some of the outcomes, potential outcomes for this setup. And go over who's in and who's out. Now that the discrepancy among the data has decreased a little bit, and we have some more confidence in what is actually going to occur today. We've also seen an increase in confidence for what's going to happen tomorrow on Tuesday from the southeast into the eastern seaboard. So we'll go over that toward the end of the video as well. But for now, we'll focus on today's event, Monday, January 8th. We still have an enhanced risk along the Gulf Coast, but it has been extended back to the west. It now includes parts of southeast Texas into southwest Louisiana. It does include the Houston Metroplex, Galveston, Beaumont, Lake Charles, under the gun for that level 3 out of 5 enhanced risk. Now, that was not the case yesterday. We saw they were just in the slight risk, level 2 out of 5, but confidence has increased in an overall severe threat in that area, and therefore the SPC has increased that threat for that area, the risk area has been upgraded. But we still have an enhanced risk within the orange area here along the Gulf Coast, southeast Texas into southern Louisiana, southern Mississippi, Alabama, western Florida Panhandle for the threat of significant severe weather going into mostly this evening. Again, the areas out to the east, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida Panhandle, that will be when the severe threat will be maximized, and that will occur during the late evening, nighttime, and overnight hours going into Tuesday morning. And this threat back here to the west in Texas, southwest Louisiana, will mostly be centered this afternoon for that threat there. We do have a tornado threat, and that has been the main reason for the increase in probabilities back to the west. We now have that 10% hashed area that stretches all the way back into West Texas. Again, the confidence has increased in a tornado threat developing in this area. Perhaps a significant tornado threat. We'll again go over that in just a second. But we now have a 10% hashed area that stretches all the way from southeast Texas toward the western Florida Panhandle, surrounding 5 and 2% areas as well. So significant tornado threats certainly on the table for this evening. We'll go over that as well here in just a minute. Damaging winds also a threat for today as well. 30% hashed area from southeast Louisiana eastward into the Florida Panhandle. Strong, significant damaging wind gusts possible as the squall line makes its way to the east this evening into the overnight hours. Very intense wind fields with this event, which we'll review here in just a second, and that will allow for the transport of those strong winds downward to the surface, and we could see gusts in excess of 70, even 80 miles an hour reaching the surface in these areas. Large hail also going to be a threat today, going to be on the back burner for the most part, and will be mostly within the more discrete supercells that form. We have very strong low-level shear in this area, so I'm not really seeing a robust hail threat unless storms for some reason remain elevated for quite a while above that strong low-level shear. But we do have somewhat of a hail threat, but again, I think the main threats today are going to be significant tornado and damaging wind risks. So let's go ahead and dive right in. We'll take a look at what's going on right now. As we talked about yesterday, we were expecting a strongly forced, kind of pencil-thin squall line here across northwest Texas, moving to the east this morning. That's exactly what we've gotten. Very intense squall line, sub-severe, but still some heavy rain, some thunder and lightning with this activity. Moving off to the east. That is the reason for the marginal risk extending so far to the north up to the Red River area. That is going to be a very marginal, isolated severe threat with this activity, mostly just maybe a damaging wind gust or two as it moves off to the east toward the Arklatex, but we should see some decrease in intensity in this squall line this morning as it races off to the east. Of more concern are these storms well out ahead of this squall line across southeast Texas. You see these bands of storms that are making their way northward across southeast Texas. Now, the warm sector is not quite up here yet, so these storms are still elevated, still not much of a severe threat with these storms at this time. But as we go into the late morning, early afternoon hours, that is going to change as the warm sector makes its way off to the northeast. These storms will start interacting with that more juicy, low-level air mass, and that is when the severe threat will start taking over. So we're going to have to watch these very closely. This is within that warm advection regime, that strong transport of low-level, warm, moist air northward into the inland. That is going to be enough to force some of these storms and allow for a severe threat. We're going to have to watch these very closely as these storms will have a tendency to be a little bit more discrete than areas back to the west and northwest. Let's also take a look at our visible satellite imagery. This has been one of the things that has plagued the confidence in this forecast is the overall destabilization in this area of southeast Texas. We talked about yesterday. If we can get surface temperatures into the low to mid 70s, that is when we're going to start to see problems, as that will allow for these storms to become more surface-based, and therefore the tornado threat and damaging wind threat will increase. And we're seeing a lot of cloud cover here across much of Texas, as was expected in this strong warm advection regime, but we're already starting to see some breaks in the clouds here along the immediate Texas coast into the western Gulf of Mexico. Those are going to make their way inland, and we should see enough instability here to support a robust severe threat in this area. So this is why the SPC has increased severe probabilities in these areas of southeast Texas, southwest Louisiana, as instability is not expected to be much of an issue as it was expected to be, say, yesterday or 2 days ago as we were forecasting this event. So let's go ahead and look at our upper air maps here. This is our 500 millibar map. And just to note here, it looks like we have an MD out right now. So this has been issued at 9:40 a.m., just about 5 minutes ago as I'm recording this. Chance for some large hail in those storms making their way northward. Again, they're still elevated well north of the warm front that's making its way northward or northeastward, where our warm sector is in South Texas right now. The storms are well north of this front, and therefore will maintain more of an isolated hail risk as they move off to the northeast in that environment. So we're talking about these storms here ahead of this squall line will foster a perhaps isolated large hail threat as we go forward in time. Again, a mesoscale discussion has been issued for this area for now, and again, we'll start to see an intensification of these cells as that warm sector moves northward late morning, early afternoon. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and go back to our upper air maps. This is our 500 millibar map, so about 18,000 feet in the atmosphere. And this is just a very textbook, high amplitude, intense trough making its way into the southern plains. Very strong flow beginning to round the base of this trough, 100 to 110, 120 knot flow on the backside of this trough that will continue to make its way eastward, rounding the base of that trough as the trough ejects into the southern plains. Just a very intense trough, very high amplitude trough. That will provide a lot of large-scale forcing for ascent for these storms in this environment. Slightly positively tilted trough at this point. That's going to change a little bit as we go into the afternoon. We'll take on a more neutral to maybe slightly negative tilt overnight as it moves eastward. Not too concerned. Trough tilt not going to play much of a role in this. It's an intense trough nonetheless. We've talked about the modulating factors of the trough tilt. Positive tilt troughs, don't have often quite as intense of a low-level response, but that is certainly not going to be the case here. And this trough is taking on a much more neutral to slightly negative tilt with time, so that shouldn't be an issue, and we should see a robust low-level response anyway. In fact, we've already started to see an extremely robust low-level response as this strong flow and this trough has traversed the southern Rockies. We have seen a very intense low-level cyclone develop already this morning. Here is at 850 millibars, about a kilometer off the surface. Here's the center of that low-level cyclone. Strong flow, strong counterclockwise curvature or rotation around that cyclone center, and a very large plume of strong low-level flow here. That's our low-level jet at this point, and that's why the low-level response and the low-level wind shear is going to be so strong with this event. Very strong southerly low-level jet here, 60, 70 plus knots of flow from the Texas coast northward into the central plains, leading to, number one, very strong moisture advection, low-level moisture advection, pumping that low-level moisture into inland into places like Texas, and very strong low-level shear. We'll take a look at some soundings here in a second. But that is going to allow for very strong, very, very strong to extreme low-level shear to foster a significant tornado event or tornado threat with this environment. This low-level jet going to shift east throughout the day, will not really decrease throughout the day at all, as sometimes we see with our nocturnal cycle. The low-level jet likes to ramp up during the nighttime, decrease during the day. Well, when you have a very, very intense low-level cyclone, that's not going to happen. We're going to see a continuation of a strong low-level jet across East Texas this morning into the early afternoon, shifting into the Gulf Coast states to the east, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, going into the evening and overnight hours tonight into tomorrow morning. And that is why we're going to see a significant tornado threat and damaging wind threat, as we'll have very, very strong winds just above the surface. At the surface, strong surface low has developed as well, moving across the Texas Panhandle. Surface low centered right there, right about the Dumas-Stratford area there in the northern Texas Panhandle. Blizzard conditions on the north side of that surface low, but ahead of that surface low, those winds have been allowed to strengthen and back. You see the pressure gradient here, these isobars very, very close together across Oklahoma and East Texas. That means very strong winds. The pressure gradient, strength of the pressure gradient modulates the strength of the wind. Because that pressure gradient's been very strong, those winds have been allowed to strengthen and back out of the southeast and really push that low-level moisture northward. into Texas. This low, again, will move off to the east through the day. This is going to be our main low center. We are expecting to see a little bit of additional low development here across East Texas going into this afternoon, which will only help further strengthen and back those low-level winds out ahead of it, increasing that tornado and damaging wind threat in southeast Texas, southwest Louisiana for this afternoon. Let's take a look at our raw surface data here. We'll update this for our most up-to-date information. And you can already see that those 60s dew points have really made their way inland very efficiently this morning. I'll draw in the rough sketch of the 60-degree isodrosotherm, or dew point line here. 60s dew points here confined to south and southeast Texas at this point, but that is going to quickly change as, again, that strong surface low up here, strong low-level flow really pushes that warm sector northeastward towards southeast and east Texas into southwest Louisiana. And as those bands of storms that are moving inland across southeast Texas interact with this moisture, we should see an uptick in severe threat with those storms. So very juicy low-level air mass. Let's take a look at the soundings to see how the quality of that low-level moisture is in the overall atmosphere. This is the observed sounding at Norman at 12Z, 6 a.m. Central Standard Time. Look at this photograph. Good thing this is well removed from the warm sector, as we'd be talking about a pretty significant severe weather event up that far north. Thankfully, the moisture not making its way up that far north for today's setup, but this is a pretty impressive looking photograph. 0 to 3 kilometer storm relative felicity in excess of 1,100 meters squared per second squared. Just to put that in perspective, what we consider adequate for tornadic supercells is about 150 meters squared per second squared of storm relative felicity in the 0 to 3 kilometer layer. We're seeing 1,100 meters squared per second squared. So that indicates, of course, very, very intense low-level shear, low-level wind fields, but also very strong warm advection. So not a surprise that we're seeing very strong warm advection across this area, given the strong low-level jet out of the south, pumping that Gulf moisture back into the region. Let's go farther to the south in our actual warm sector here. This is at Corpus Christi at 12Z, so right down in here. And you can see a couple of different things on this particular sounding. Number one, very deep low-level moisture. Low-level moisture extending up above 850 millibars. The red line, of course, our temperature profile. Green line is our dew point. Those very close together, up above 850 millibars, indicating fairly deep moisture associated with this setup. So we often like to see these deep moist layers for a robust severe threat. That means a lot more juicy air that these storms have to work with in the low levels. Now that is kind of a double-edged sword though, and that is a reason why a lot of the models are not really intensifying the storms across southeast Texas this afternoon, and why we've struggled to intensify a lot of the storms in southeast Texas on a lot of the previous model runs, despite what is now looking to be adequate, even more than adequate instability across this area. Look at the low-level lapse rates here. 0 to 3 kilometer lapse rates, only about 4.5 degrees Celsius per kilometer. Now that does take into account this little bit of capping inversion here, just right up to and just beneath 3 kilometers. So that is a little bit lower than what it probably is here through this maybe 0 to 2 kilometer layer. Probably looking at about 5 to 5.5 degrees Celsius per kilometer or so in this layer. That's still well below what we like to see for robust updrafts. We like to see anything in excess of 6 degrees Celsius per kilometer. Again, the lapse rate is that change in temperature with height as you go up in the atmosphere. Anything above 6 degrees Celsius per kilometer is considered to be adequate for robust updrafts. We're seeing values well below that here in this situation. So that might be a hindering factor to the severe threat, even though we're seeing robust instability already building in this area and likely to build even further throughout the morning into early afternoon. Already about 1,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE across this area. But we'll have to watch that for sure, as in strongly sheared environments, if we don't have robust updrafts, they're going to get shredded apart. I think we have enough instability to support robust, sustained updrafts, but getting them going might be a little bit difficult given the weak low-level lapse rates here, weak low-level updrafts in this event. So we'll have to watch that for sure, but the main idea is that we have robust instability, very strong low-level shear as well for a robust severe threat. Strongly curved low-level photographs here, strongly veering and strengthening winds with height, going from about 10 knots out of the south-southeast at the surface to about 50 knots here at 850 millibars out of the south-southwest. So strongly veering and strengthening winds with height, leading to that very strong low-level shear in this environment. Quite a bit of backing here in the mid-levels at this point. This is your typical M-shaped type of photograph here. This is pretty intense backing in the mid-levels, and I'm not 100% sure why. Maybe we're just not quite in the strongest mid-level flow, low to mid-level flow at this point. As the trough continues to move east, I do expect this to work itself out a little bit. But this is quite a bit of backing. This is almost 180 degrees of backing there in the mid-levels, and that is starting to verge on the amount that's a little bit too much and that may start hindering low-level mesocyclone sustenance. Now, the processes going on in the supercell have more influence over that, and so it may not matter a whole lot, but this is quite a bit of backing here, and something we'll have to look at. If this works itself out, which I do expect that it will to some degree, if this works itself out, we should still have a stage set for significant severe weather across this area. But nonetheless, strong low-level shear here in this environment, strong deep layer shear for supercells, and pretty good thermodynamics already. Strong mixed layer instability on the increase, deep moist layer beneath this capping inversion, maybe a little bit of an elevated mixed layer or EML. Here advecting across the region. That's that layer of warm, dry, well-mixed air that emanates from the desert southwest and western Mexico, gets transported to the east atop the moist layer, and allows for and keeps convective development at bay for much of the day. Well, we've seen that this cap is not all that strong here at all, and that's why we've seen a lot of convection already getting its way going. I would, if I were to guess, I would expect that this might even be eroded by this point, as we're starting to already see that 500 millibar flow, that stronger forcing aloft, start to impinge into this region. So we're probably already seeing some erosion of this cap that was not very strong to begin with, which is why we're seeing a lot of activity already across this area. And these storms will only continue to increase in coverage and intensity going into the late morning, early afternoon hours as that cap erodes fully. But again, we'll have to watch that weak low-level lapse rate plume to see if those updrafts can really get robust and really tap into that full deep layer instability. So let's go ahead and look at some model data here. This is the 12Z NAM. Actually, let me go forward here. We're on the 6Z run. So this is the 12Z NAM, hot off the press from this morning. Starting at 500 millibars, we'll look at our 500 millibar trough here. Very potent trough here across the western half of the country, digging down into the southern plains. You'll see as we go through the day, starts to take on a much more neutral tilt by the afternoon. Really strong flow rounding the base of that trough, inducing very strong forcing into this region. And very strong flow aloft, really strong deep layer shear as a result, favorable for supercells and organized severe weather. This is a very, very textbook, intense trough making its way into the southern plains. So that is how it looks going to look by 6 p.m. Central Standard Time tonight. Lots of forcing here across the region. We'll go forward in time here. You'll see that trough the center of the trough ejects off to the northeast, and this has been a question mark with Tuesday's event. As of yesterday, we had a lot of discrepancy in where this trough was going to set up. The center of the trough here up into Illinois by midday tomorrow. We take a look at the GFS, which was a lot farther south on yesterday's model runs. It is pretty much the same here. Center might be just a tad south, but overall the idea is the same. The overall trough is moving off a little bit more to the northeast, and so we're much more in agreement with the overall progression of this trough going into tomorrow, so we can start to make some judgments on Tuesday. And again, we'll do that toward the end of the video. But very strong flow associated with this trough, 130 plus knots of flow modeled here up into the Midwest, out ahead of the trough center there. Lots of strong flow spreading across the southeast and eastern seaboard states there. So kinematics with this event certainly not lacking at all. Let's go back in time and then look at our 850 millibar map. You'll start to see at 12Z here this morning that very strong plume of low-level flow from Texas northward into the central plains. Very strong low-level jet, and that's not going to change throughout the day. Very strong low-level flow maintains through the early afternoon hours into East Texas. Strong flow there. And we'll only see this increase going into the evening hours as this low-level cyclone intensifies even further. Here we are at about midnight. We see some blues in there indicative of 90-plus knots of low-level flow of about a kilometer off the surface. That is just incredible. Usually you're lucky to see in an intense severe weather event 50, 60, 70 knots of low-level jet. Here we're seeing 80, 90 plus knots of flow just a kilometer off the surface. That is pretty incredible here to see. And that is what is going to allow for that very strong low-level wind shear to overspread this area as the storms move off to the east, and that is going to foster that significant tornado and damaging wind threat with this event. So very strong low-level flow. That low-level jet will continue into the off to the east tomorrow. Very broad low-level jet there from the northeast down into the southeast states. strong low-level shear. That's why the increase in tornado threat has occurred for tomorrow across the eastern, for tomorrow across the eastern seaboard into the southeast. Down to the surface here, let me zoom into the southern plains sector so we can see how this low-level, the surface cyclone develops. So here at 12Z was the NAM initialization of the surface low up there in the northwest Texas Panhandle. That will continue off to the east during the day, and we're expecting to see a little bit of perhaps secondary surface low development, weak surface low development here across East Texas. You see a little bit of troughing in the isobars here, indicative of maybe a secondary low center, a weak secondary low center developing here across East Texas this afternoon. That will only help to strengthen and back those low-level winds out ahead of it, maintaining that tornado and damaging wind threat with any storms out ahead of that secondary surface low. And that cold front, which has fired the storms this morning, will continue to push off to the east pretty quickly. We can see that in our moisture map, which we'll take a look at in a second. But that low will continue to push off to the east today. Secondary low center moving well off to the east by midnight. It's already here, at least on the NAM run here in Mississippi. Warm sector to the south of that, fostering that severe threat moving off to the east. Cold front stretching down to the south from that secondary surface low southwest, and that will be our secondary initiation mechanism for that main squall line that will move through with our significant tornado and damaging wind threat this evening. So let's go and take a look at our moisture here. So again, we've already seen those 60s dew points start to make their way inland. That will continue to push off to the northeast going into the late morning, early afternoon hours today. This is 18Z. Warm sector extends from basically Houston, Galveston, northwestward to the Waco area, down toward Austin, San Antonio, down into South Texas. So not a very large warm sector inland by any means, but still plenty of real estate for robust convection here. And that's why most of these storms for now are going to remain elevated north of that warm front as they cross or are north of that warm front. They'll be elevated above that low-level shear, perhaps initiating a hail threat with those storms there. But any storms moving off the Gulf into this warm, robust environment inland will have that significant tornado and damaging wind threat with them, and they will tend to be a little bit more discreet because of the lesser forcing out here in the open warm sector. Moving on to 21Z, 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, that warm sector continues to push off to the east. And then by 0Z, cold front really starts to take over with that secondary surface low developing in there in East Texas. Cold front will really start to be progressive, push off to the east, initiating that secondary round of storms that will be our main severe threat out across parts of southern Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Intense squall line expected to develop along this secondary cold front. We'll take a look at the storm mode here right now. So our cold front back in here, and our shear vectors are expected to remain very much parallel to the initiating boundary there. Quick transition to a linear, to a squall line along that cold front, given these shear parallel, these line parallel, or boundary parallel shear vectors, and the very progressive, strongly forced nature of the cold front. Quick transition to a squall line there, packing a punch as it moves off to the east. But again, we'll have to watch for the discrete development out ahead of that line in the strong warm advection regime, prefrontal warm advection regime. So we'll continue to move off to the east. That warm sector will continue to move off to the east in the overnight hours. Plenty of wind shear in play, as we saw, to maintain, plenty of forcing and wind shear to maintain that significant severe threat with that cold front squall line as it moves off to the east. And again, we'll have to watch for discrete development out ahead in the open warm sector this evening. Let's take a couple soundings here out ahead. We'll take one. We'll start at 18Z here, just west of the Houston area, well within the warm sector, just to see what we'll start to see here in the morning hours. I want to make sure those storms in southeast Texas are behaving at this point. Not seeing any warnings right now for those storms. They are starting to perk up in intensity there. We'll have to watch that for sure as they move off to the east. But again, they're probably north of that warm front already, crossing that warm front and will become more elevated here. But we'll continue to see these bands of storms move inland, and that will be our main severe threat with discrete supercells late this morning into early afternoon. So this is 18Z, noon. So lunchtime, Central Standard Time here, just west of the Houston metro area. And the NAM is already showing a potent environment here, very strong instability. You know, a couple days ago, we were forecasting maybe 500 to 1,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE, but now we're seeing in excess of 2,500 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE here on this particular NAM run already by midday. That is pretty impressive. Pretty fat CAPE as well. Strong instability through the environment. 0 to 3 kilometer CAPE also very strong as well. Approaching 200 joules per kilogram of 3 CAPE. That is pretty impressive for low-level updraft stretching of any low-level spin into the vertical to aid in tornadogenesis in supercells. We see a little bit of that saturated layer there, which may decrease low-level lapse rates, but this sounding with robust low-level and deep layer instability, that shouldn't be too much of an issue. And the fact that we have a very strongly veering wind profile with height in the low level, strongly clockwise curved hodograph, this will certainly favor significant tornadoes. A little bit of that backing there in the mid-level still. Again, I think that works itself out going into the afternoon hours, but strong low-level shear, supercell storm mode shouldn't be too much of an issue here, given robust instability. So this is certainly a significant tornado environment making its way inland as early as midday here, late morning to midday across southeast Texas. That warm sector will continue to shift to the northeast. We'll take a sounding here at Houston at 21Z, 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, just to see how the environment will progress through the day into the afternoon. Again, this is at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. This is pretty darn impressive for a significant tornado environment. Very strong instability, 3,000 joules per kilogram plus mixed layer instability. This may be on the higher edge of the guidance, but still it's looking like we might see upwards of 1,500 to 2,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE, more than adequate for a robust severe threat with this setup. Strong low-level shear here as well, strongly veering and strengthening winds in the low levels of the atmosphere. Pretty impressive looking setup here for significant tornadoes possible with any sustained supercells. Now again, we'll have to watch that low-level profile to see if that that will be a hindrance, but if this type of setup, type of thermodynamic environment sets up, that's not going to be an issue. 0 to 3 kilometer CAPE in excess of 200 joules per kilogram. This is a pretty nasty looking sounding for parts of southeast Texas, including the Houston Metroplex, Galveston, and eventually Beaumont, as that warm sector moves off to the east. Now, by this point, the cold front will take over. Starting in late afternoon, we'll start to see initiation of storms along the cold front. Quick transition to a squall line, and let's take a sounding out ahead. College football championship game is in Houston this evening, so folks out there in Houston, tailgating, attending the game, whatnot, definitely need to pay attention to the weather this evening, as it could get pretty nasty this early afternoon through the evening hours today before the cold front pushes east of the area. So this is what we're seeing at 0Z, closer to that cold front. We're seeing a little bit of veering of those low-level winds here. You don't see as much of curvature in the low-level hodograph. That is a good sign for more of a damaging wind threat rather than a tornado threat, with storms forming along that cold front there in southeast Texas. Out here farther to the east in southwest Louisiana, we would expect us to continue to maintain that strong low-level shear profile there. So any discrete supercells out ahead of that line, developing second line along the cold front, will have a tornado threat. Certainly more of a low-level shear profile there for significant tornadoes, strong instability as well. So that is pretty impressive there. Along in southeast Texas, we've seen an increase in the confidence in higher instability across this area, and hence the increase in probabilities, severe probabilities, including the tornado threat across southeast Texas today. Cold front will rapidly push east going into the evening hours. This is at 9 p.m. 6Z, midnight. Cold front rapidly pushing east. Storms along that cold front will be very well organized into a squall line, with extremely strong shear out ahead of this squall line, as we saw very, very intense low-level jet helping to aid in the formation of embedded circulations, potentially strong circulations within that squall line, hence the 10% hashed area for tornadoes here. This is pretty incredible looking profile here out ahead of this squall line, as that low-level jet, the low-level jet literally is off the chart. The hodograph is off the chart because the low-level jet is so strong. 850 millibar winds in excess of 70 knots here. Just pretty incredible sight to see. More than adequate instability here, 2,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. Decent low-level instability as well. More than decent low-level instability here, progged by the NAM, almost 200 joules per kilogram of 0 to 3 kilometer CAPE, maintaining itself in this environment. And this low-level hodograph, this hodograph is pretty darn impressive. Deep layer shear at 70 plus knots. Their effective bulk shear 73 knots on this sounding. Again, this is at midnight out ahead of the squall line, southern Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. And that low-level hodograph is pretty darn impressive. Super strong veering of the winds and strengthening of the winds in the low levels. I mean, you see 15 knots here at the surface. veering out of the southeast, veering to 70 plus knots there at 850 millibars out of the south-southwest. So the direction is certainly veering, and the strength, we're increasing by about 60 knots or so in just about a kilometer's worth of distance above the surface. That is pretty darn impressive, leading to intense, extreme low-level shear in excess of 600 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity, strongly curved low-level photographs. That is certainly a look for significant tornadoes, both embedded in any circulations with any circulations in the line, as well as in any discrete supercells that form out ahead of the line. Those will have a strong tornado threat as well. It's also going to lead to a significant damaging wind threat. There will be quite a few downdrafts in this convective line, and that is going to allow the downward mixing of this very strong flow to the surface. So that is why we're expecting to see a significant wind threat with this activity, with the squall line especially, as though this stronger flow, 60, 70 plus knots of flow there in the low levels, transported down to the surface via downdrafts and mixing. So that is going to allow for some significant damaging wind gusts with that squall line, and of course that significant tornado threat as well. So let's take a look here at some convection allowing models here. We'll take a look at the 12Z HER just to start off with, and we'll look at Monday's event. Then we'll talk about Tuesday here just briefly at the end of the video. So initialized here are pencil-thin sort of squall line there across northwest Texas. Initialized pretty well, moves off to the east, loses some steam here as we go into the late morning, early afternoon hours, and you see a lot of this convection here out across East Texas into southwest Louisiana this morning, showing some robust helicity tracks there, some more robust updrafts there in this kind of somewhat messy but still semi-discrete blob, semi-discrete storms within this blob, but those will have a tornado threat this morning into the early afternoon hours as they move off to the east. Now, interestingly, we don't see a lot of redevelopment here out ahead of the squall line. Squall line developing here by late afternoon here in southeast Texas. Not much to speak of out ahead of that, interestingly enough. And this has been a trend with some of the convection allowing models this morning. We'll take a look at that here in just shortly. But you see, as we go into the evening hours, that squall line really starts to develop out across the Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama corridor. Very intense squall line there. I'll shift to the southeast sector here, so we can see the progression of that squall line into tomorrow morning. Very intense looking. You see a lot of convective development out here over the Gulf moving inland by this afternoon into early evening. Those will have that significant tornado threat as well. Any discrete supercells preceding the line, even well out ahead of the line, close to that warm front where the eastern edge of the warm sector exists. But squall line certain to be very intense here. Strong damaging wind gusts and embedded significant tornadoes, especially across this corridor from southeast Louisiana, southern Mississippi, into southern Alabama, in the western Florida Panhandle. And there's given strong forcing for ascent. This squall line really not going to let up going into the morning hours tomorrow. This is at 10 a.m. Eastern time tomorrow. Still a very intense squall line going forward, and that will allow for a continuation of the significant tornado and significant damaging wind threat going into the morning hours tomorrow. Let's go to our WRF ARW model. We'll go back to our Southern Plains sector here. There's our strongly forced squall line here. Again, isolated severe threat as it moves off to the east this morning into early afternoon, but it should lose some steam going into the afternoon hours. Only an isolated damaging wind gust or two, as most of these storms up here are going to remain elevated. The ARW model has quite a bit of convection here in east and southeast Texas, southwest Louisiana. You'll notice it doesn't get super robust, though. And we don't have a ton of stuff, a lot of activity here in extreme southeast Texas into the late afternoon, mid to late afternoon hours. And that is still a question, as we talked about with these models. They're still showing a lack of robustness to these updrafts down in this area, despite having what is now an increase in instability in this area and strong low-level and deep layer shear. So that'll be something to watch, whether that low-level kind of saturated layer and weak lapse rate layer is going to be a hindrance to this event. I would tend to think it's not going to be too much of an issue, especially if we can get some breaks in the clouds, which, as we looked at on satellite, it does look like we're seeing some breaks in the clouds there across southeast Texas. So I don't expect this to be too much of an issue in getting robust convection down here, but it could be a hindrance to the overall event. But confidence has increased enough to warrant an increase in severe probabilities here for southeast Texas, and I do think we'll see a few robust updrafts down there with a tornado and damaging wind threat. Then we'll see that squall lines start to take shape there into the evening hours, really start to get an intense squall line by about the late evening into early morning hours tomorrow morning. Shift to our southeast sector here. And pretty much the same as what we were seeing on the HRRR. Lots of little beans moving ashore ahead of that squall line that develops. Very intense squall line there, but lots of beans out ahead of the squall line that we'll have to watch for a significant tornado and damaging wind threat. And that squall line will push off to the east pretty quickly. See a few pretty intense supercells out ahead of the main line there across the Florida Panhandle tomorrow morning. And again, there's going to be no let up with this line tomorrow morning. We'll continue that damaging wind and tornado threat going into the morning hours of Tuesday. NSSL WRF model, one last convective allowing model to look at here for the Monday, Tuesday morning threat. Again, strongly forced squall line there this morning. Lots of convection there with a tornado and damaging wind threat going into the early afternoon hours today, midday, early afternoon hours today. Then we see again, the NSSL WRF not showing much behind that initial band. Very interesting to note that. I'm not sure why that's the case. The overall idea, though, is that anybody in the southeast Texas, southwest Louisiana corridor needs to be prepared if we see some renewed convection behind these initial bands of storms that we're seeing out here across this area. As those we could definitely see some redevelopment into some more intense supercells with that activity. But again, the main line will develop here going into the late evening hours across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. That will pack a punch as it moves off to the east with a significant tornado damaging wind threat. And lots of convection moving onshore with a potential for some strongly tornadic supercells out ahead of the main squall line. But that squall line should definitely, at minimum, pack a punch with some strong winds and embedded tornadoes. So the models are pretty much in line for today. Interesting that they're not showing a ton of activity in southeast Texas becoming super robust. Again, I don't think that's going to matter a whole lot. That low-level weak lapse rate layer will still have strong instability, strong low-level shear to help overcome that. But we'll have to watch that for sure. But the main idea is that anybody here in southeast Texas to southwest Louisiana still needs to take this event seriously, especially if you're in Houston for the championship, the college football championship game. Certainly need to keep an eye on the sky for that. Any discrete supercells late this morning into the afternoon hours, potentially packing a significant tornado threat there. Let's talk about Tuesday real quick. So this is our Tuesday outlook now. The SPC is now included all of the Eastern Carolinas in that enhanced risk level 3 out of 5, that orange shaded area, extending all the way from the Florida Panhandle northeastward through Georgia and South and North Carolina for tomorrow in morning into the afternoon. So confidence has increased in an overall severe threat farther north with this activity. And as a result, we've seen an increase in the tornado threat. Two different 10% hashed areas. This southern one mostly will be for that squall line, but any potential discrete development closely preceding or just ahead of that squall line going into tomorrow morning. And then the idea for a round of discrete supercells, warm advection supercells out ahead of the main line, moving into the Carolinas tomorrow afternoon. That is still a little bit on the conditional side, but confidence has increased enough to warrant a 10% hashed area and an increase in severe probabilities farther north. Damaging wind, also a threat all the way up and down this area as the squall line makes its way east. And with any more robust supercells, could see some damaging winds as well, 30% hashed area there. So again, 60, 70 plus mile an hour wind gusts possible within that line as it moves off to the east. Hail not going to be much of a threat tomorrow. That'll be certainly on the back burner as we'll have very intense low-level shear that will help negate the overall large hail threat. But we do have that tornado and damaging wind threat that is going to be the most notable threat for tomorrow. So let's take a look quickly at some of the data for tomorrow. I'll go back to our maps here just to refresh how the upper level pattern is going to progress through the night. So this is midnight tonight. And we'll go into the day tomorrow. That center of the low ejects, center of the upper trough ejects off to the northeast. Strong flow overspreading the region. Forcing certainly not going to be in short supply with this event. We have very strong flow aloft all the way across the eastern seaboard states here with this trough. I'm sure if we were to go up to 250 millibars, we'd see very strong defluence aloft, and that we do. Very strong defluence aloft, the spreading apart of those wind vectors in the upper levels of the atmosphere. That creates a void. Mother Nature doesn't like that void, so it brings up air from below to fill that, and that's how we get large-scale rising motion for ascent. We have a ton of that here across the East Coast states going into tomorrow. Down at 850 millibars, we saw that low-level jet is going to really persist into across a very widespread region there going into tomorrow afternoon, allowing for the continuation of the tornado and wind threat with the squall line, and also strong shear for any discrete supercells out ahead of the main line, especially across the Carolinas and the Florida Panhandle area tomorrow. So let's go down to the surface, see how that surface low progresses. You'll see that main center across Oklahoma moves its way off to the northeast going into tomorrow. That secondary surface low there with that secondary cold front there across moving into the Carolinas tomorrow. There's our cold front squall line ongoing by tomorrow morning into the midday hours there. Potential for discrete supercell development out ahead of the main line. And then also with this strong southerly or southeasterly flow, strong warm advection in the low levels there across the Carolinas, that is going to allow for probably some degree of forcing for ascent for isolated supercells well out ahead of the line. And that's why we have that strong tornado threat there for the Carolinas going into tomorrow afternoon. Dew point temperatures, not going to be an issue. We'll have plenty of moisture to deal with here. Let me go down to our southeast sector here. And you'll see plenty of moisture. It advects its way northward ahead of that squall line here by tomorrow afternoon. We'll take a sounding here from South Carolina, eastern South Carolina at 21 Z, so 4 p.m. Eastern time. And we'll take one here from the Florida Panhandle, just out ahead of the squall line tomorrow morning. So you can see there that we have, I mean, that's pretty darn impressive. Not as much instability as areas farther to the south, but that wind profile, I mean, the photograph is literally, you can't see half of it because it's off the chart because that low-level jet is so intense. 75, 80 knots of low-level flow there. That is just really impressive with adequate instability to support robust convection. Farther to the south, instability not as high. This may be a NAM quirk here, but this wind profile certainly would support significant tornadoes in any supercells. And of course, ahead of the line, that would support line-embedded circulations that could be strong as well. So that's going to pretty much wrap things up for this event. We'll take a look quickly at the overall models. I'll zoom to our convection allowing models. I'll zoom back to the southeast sector. Just looking at a couple of models here, you'll see through the morning, we may see some of these beans start to develop out ahead of the main line here across the Carolinas with a tornado damaging wind threat. NSSL WRF a little bit less gung-ho than some of the other models on that threat. Here's the WRF ARW model. Lots of robust convection immediately ahead of the line tomorrow morning across the Florida Panhandle. And then we see additional development out ahead of the squall line there. Not too robust. Again, cams a day out are not all that reliable. So keep that in mind. Take that with a grain of salt. But the threat is there, certainly for a few supercells there tomorrow afternoon ahead of the line across the Carolinas. Let's take a look at the HER. And much of the same potential for supercells ahead of the line, and then the threat for some more robust updrafts there in the Carolinas going into tomorrow afternoon ahead of the squall line. So pretty robust event tomorrow, and overall as a whole, very robust event. One of the stronger kinematic events I've seen in quite a while. These wind profiles are super impressive. So that is going to do it for this video. Once again, let's see if the new Outlook is out. It's not quite out yet, but I don't expect a lot of changes with this Outlook going into the afternoon hours. So this is what we have right now. Again, level 3 out of 5 enhanced risk in the orange shaded area there from southeast Texas into the western Florida Panhandle. Initial round of storms is already in progress there across North Texas. That strongly forced but kind of thin squall line we saw there. Isolated severe gust or two out there across North Texas there today or this morning, going into the early afternoon. And then we'll see an uptick in severe threat for the southeast Texas area as those bands of supercells continue to make their way onshore. And they will pose a tornado and damaging wind threat, perhaps a significant tornado threat. But it looks like instability will be robust enough to support intense updrafts there today. So anyone in southeast Texas, Houston, Galveston, Beaumont, toward southwest Louisiana, Lake Charles, needs to be on alert for a few supercells with a tornado and damaging wind threat this afternoon. Then we'll see that secondary line of storms form along that secondary cold front from that new surface low development in East Texas. That will really strengthen that cold front to the southwest, and that cold front will rapidly push off to the east, quickly organizing those storms into a squall line across southern Louisiana, southern Mississippi, and Alabama into the western Florida Panhandle. And we will see an intense squall line given strong, extreme low-level wind fields that will support even strong tornadoes embedded within the line, as well as significant damaging wind gusts reaching the surface. That line will march to the east overnight, won't really let up into tomorrow morning across the Florida Panhandle, Alabama, Georgia, into tomorrow afternoon. And we will see a significant tornado threat and damaging wind gust threat with that as well. Again, the main threats with this event are going to be the significant tornado threat, 10% hatched area there from southeast Texas into the Florida Panhandle for that round of storms. And again, we could see discrete storms ahead of that line as it moves off to the east with an all hazards threat as well. But significant tornado threat is going to be the main threat, as well as damaging winds. Wouldn't even be surprised to see them upgrade this for maybe a wind threat at some point, because the low-level wind fields are certainly intense. And even though the storm mode may not be overall favorable for long-track significant tornadoes, certainly strong tornadoes within the line, but not maybe long-track tornadoes, the wind threat could be a little bit more intense than expected. So I would not be surprised to see them issue a moderate risk here, maybe for an uptick in wind probabilities, but we'll see. Certainly, anybody in these areas needs to be on alert for some significant straight-line damaging wind gusts, as well as those strong tornadoes embedded within the line, and in any discrete supercells out ahead of the line. Then we go into tomorrow, Tuesday, January 9th. That squall line will continue off to the east, and we'll have the potential for discrete supercells ahead of the line across Florida and Georgia going into tomorrow morning. And then we'll see a possible separate batch of warm advection discrete supercells along the eastern Carolina coastal areas for tomorrow afternoon ahead of the main squall line. And then by tomorrow evening, we'll see that squall line push off to the east into the Atlantic, and we'll be all good and done with this event. So anybody in these areas needs to be on alert for significant severe weather, especially in the orange shaded areas. So Houston, Galveston, Beaumont, Texas, Lake Charles, New Orleans, Gulfport, Biloxi, Mobile, Pensacola. For tonight's threat, for today and tonight's threat, you are under the gun for the greatest severe threat with this environment. Folks at the college football championship game certainly need to be on alert for significant severe weather today. There, if you're tailgating, definitely keep your eye to the sky. Keep those keep the weather information sources handy, and you'll get through it just fine. And then off to the east, same thing. Keep those weather radios handy. Stay tuned to your local National Weather Service and the Storm Prediction Center for the most up-to-date information. And as that goes for tomorrow as well. The threat will be ongoing at the start of tomorrow, going in through all the way through the afternoon tomorrow, up along from Florida, Georgia, northeastward into the Carolinas. Anybody there needs to be on alert for significant severe weather tomorrow, including that strong tornado and damaging wind threat that could be pretty intense. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.